What kind of a woman does it take to debunk what you think you know? Well, round of applause to Dr. Nidhi. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, such a pleasure, such an honor, and thank you. It was I think a bunch of weeks ago when I think I woke up to my LinkedIn sort of notifications and I saw that you tagged me for something that I'd done,
Yeah.
and I don't think we knew each other at the time, and it was a very warming, heartwarming feeling for
Mm.
me. So when you asked me to join here, it was absolutely an honor. So thank you. It's so great to be here. Love what you
Well,
do as well.
well, that's so nice because I started thinking who does not get enough credit and who is fighting for women and equality, diversity, inclusion. Who's fighting for all of that stuff? And I was like, yeah, the women are fighting for it, but the only way that it's ever going to come into the companies is if HR and women who are talking to all the different levels are going to be doing it, running conferences, debunking, challenging.
Yeah.
And so I thought, let's highlight
Awesome.
you.
Thank you. Thank you. So great.
Great. So debunking, it's just such a fun word. Debunk,
I know.
right? So to my Spanish people listening, debunk means really to prove otherwise, I suppose, in a simple term, because you don't learn that in ESL classes. So tell me, I saw your post and I thought this is fun and your video on debunking. So can you tell me some of the things that you love to debunk because it like frees us from the crap that we learned when we were younger?
Yeah, and I agree. Like the debunk such a strange and cool and funny word in its own way, but it's for me. It's not so much that I'd love to debunk it, but when I see that they're so popular. So just to give an idea, debunking something is this notion that some idea, some notion, a practice becomes so popular to the point that it becomes a trend, and then everything starts to believe that it is the way to do, and then nobody questions it, and that's very dangerous. That's very dangerous. So rather than me positioning it as I love to debunk it, I see the danger in it, I see the concern with it, and I understand that it's gonna have a resource cost, time cost, learning cost to people, especially younger learners. If we're talking about elementary kids and secondary school kids and stuff, then I feel like I have to step in and say that, well, pause for a second and let's just ask the question: do we have large scale data to actually prove something? So what you noticed in that particular one, I mean, people can debunk lots of things, but in this particular scenario that you came across, that you saw, was I was presenting a case that we need to really question a lot of the popular educational myths. They're also known as neuromyths or edumyths. You can call them with different names. So a really, really popular one, and I think it's ingrained in all of us, and we believe that it is something that we do, is learning styles. So that's probably the post that you came across, and you may have heard people say, "Oh, you know what? I learn. I'm a visual learner, and I learn by watching videos, okay, or by looking at pictures." Or people say, "I'm a kinesthetic learner. I really need to hold something." And it actually feels right to believe that, because humans have this necessary need almost to be categorized into certain buckets, and then we feel like I belong in this group. And something that works for me was heard by instruction or whatever someone was doing. So it's not such a bad thing to have that, but to believe that this is the way to learn, and then we start to design instruction and publish books and do professional development, do lots of programming, that's millions of dollars I'm talking about, and learning loss that's going to happen afterwards that people will not question, or we should be questioning. That's sort of when I say, actually, you know what, we're all multimodal learners. We actually all learn with all those modalities. If I have to learn the piano, it doesn't matter if I'm a visual learner. I cannot learn the piano by just watching videos. I'm going to have to put my fingers on, and I'm going to have to do all that practice, the right hand, the left hand, and the reversal, and this and that. It same goes with swimming, right? So believing that I'm a visual learner is one thing, or kinesthetic learner is one thing, but actually designing the entire way we do instruction, that's a really big problem. Why? Because what happens is, there, at a conversational level, it's not a big deal. But when you go into a classroom, or when you're designing training programs for people, then we've kind of like started to stereotype a lot of people. So very early on in the age to a child, we say, oh, you're a visual learner, which means you're not kinesthetic. So a lot of like, forget about the violin, right? Like it's not something
Oh,
you ever do. You know,
yeah.
that's the danger. The second thing is the time cost that comes with actually aligning instruction with all those. Now imagine if this, there's many different ways to decide to call learning styles, but four are really popular. We call them VARC: visual, audio, kinesthetic, reading, writing, right? VARC is the really popular theory. And I'll tell you something about it in a second. So if you, let's say, had just four varieties and people had combinations of those, imagine being in the classroom and doing one lesson four different ways for so many people.
Oh,
That's not possible. That's very inefficient, very impractical. What's amazing is that we are, sure, we have our differences, but we are also very similar when learning happens, right? Learning in our brain happens very similar ways. Differences are how much knowledge you have and things like that. So it's much more efficient to design learning that actually casts the net and gets more learners, right? So that's where I talk about cognitive science. So when I hear of people trying to do that, they have the right intention. They're saying, I'm trying to make sure all my students learn, but it's not going to work because it's very cost expensive. It's very inefficient. And what's going to happen is that a handful of learners will learn and then the others won't. And then there's a teacher burnout or instructor burnout or trainer burnout. You can't. Then the question becomes, well, where did this VARC thingy come from?
Tony Robbins.
Well, yeah. I know. There's a lot of popularity out there, right? It was a New Zealand superintendent somewhere in school, and he came up with it. And he had the right intention, but there were never any studies done
Oh,
to
really?
actually say that. I'm not saying that we are not categorized. People do have preferences. I'm having a coffee right now, and I have a preference for coffee right now. People do have learning preferences. I do sometimes like to watch. It's easy to watch a video than actually read a very complex text. Like that makes sense, right? I'm not saying people don't have preferences. They do have preferences. But the question is it going to be more effective if I design instruction matching with someone's so-called learning style? That there is no evidence for that. There is no evidence for that. And that's my biggest thing. And so you're going to say something. Go ahead.
So I live in Spain, and Marco is my buddy that I met a couple weeks ago, and he was teaching us the word for debunking, which is very long. Desenmascarar. Oh, it's like taking a mask off, which is interesting.
Desenmascarar. Oh.
And I was in China, and I just read something on LinkedIn about how Chinese kids are getting AI in their classrooms at like age 6. And China is mind-blowing. And as I grew up in Canada, and Americans, we have similar stuff. They just give us so much crap to debunk about how the world is. You know what I mean? So I can almost not trust anything that was told. When we were young, we're about the same age, they told us that your brain doesn't grow anymore, right? Brain damage and you're effed. It's like, and then like 10 years ago, they were like, oh, we were wrong about that. And you're like, what? How could you be so wrong about that? Without very big apologies that I noticed in the national news. So these people who are thought leaders who bring out new research without, do they get, like, sometimes that could almost be a crime, because if you spread misinformation just because you want to sell your book, Mr. New Zealand guy, whatever his intentions were, are there consequences in the research world? Like, you're running a research conference. I'm just curious.
Yeah. Oh, I wish there were more consequences than we thought. But, think about it. A researcher or someone in a position of power coming from a lot of knowledge, you look up to that person, right? So they say something and then you want to believe it because you want someone to show you the ropes because you can't do the groundwork. If we all could do that critical sort of analysis, then we'd all be in, doctoral degrees. But it's not for everybody else. Not everybody can do that research work. So we believe in someone's abilities to show us the right thing. Teachers. So it's not teachers' fault or instructors' fault or trainers' fault that they believed in the learning styles. But it's the system's sort of error that it was presented to them and not a critical perspective was presented to them as well. Or the idea that, well, you know what, don't take everything or don't believe everything I say also. I'm going to say that in this live session. Don't believe everything I say. Go look it up. Knowledge is really power. Now I know people like to say information is power. Oh my goodness, there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation. It really is knowledge. Knowledge is power. So gain the knowledge, get the facts right, and then make the decisions based on that. So my worry was, and I won't lie, when I was doing my teacher training back in the day, I believed in learning styles too, because as I said, it feels
Sure.
right to believe in it. It makes sense. I was like, oh yeah, I need to, if I'm learning a language and you're teaching me words for different vocabulary, I speak German, for example. So yeah, well, if I touch an apple in my hand, oh yeah, there's something kinesthetic going on. My brain's developing more synapses, perhaps. It felt right. But now I know better because I've read the research. And my question always is that the most attack when I try to debunk learning styles or any educational myth for that matter, people say, well, you are saying it doesn't exist, so but what's the evidence that it doesn't exist, right? Because I challenge that it doesn't. So then I say, well, in the world of research, the burden is on the person who is claiming that something exists. If you believe unicorns exist, then you have to prove that to me, right?
Mhm.
I'm going to say they don't exist. They're beautiful, by the way. My kids love them too. I mean, I'm not saying unicorns are bad, but I'm just giving an example that if you believe in them, then it's the burden is on you to prove that to me and show me
Yeah.
evidence, right? And then I will believe it, or at least I'll analyze the evidence, right? So the attack is very easy to say, well, if you say they don't believe, what's the proof they don't believe? Well, you can't prove a negative, right? Right. So that's the idea. So my you asked the question about sort of is there, accountability? I hope there was more. There is some. It
Hmm.
usually happens quite late. It usually happens after multiple years and
Hmm.
decades sometimes have passed. And what happens is a lot of learning loss happens, a lot of dollars are wasted, a lot of professional development sessions have been done, and people have believed, you'll see this becomes a fire, like it spreads like fire. And then someone says, well, kids are not reading. What are we doing wrong? It's like, oh, and then you go back to it. And I'm not blaming everything on learning styles, just to be clear. I'm just saying it's one example, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good
And
one.
the question goes back again and again to evidence. So you mentioned my conference too. So I'm organizing the Research Ed conference in Toronto. Research Ed is a grassroots initiative. It's a global movement that originated in the UK, I think back in 2013. And it's a fantastic idea. The goal was just like this idea that, well, there's all this research being written by scholars, and then scholars publish that in journals, and other scholars read it, but it's educational research, but it was not entering the classroom. The classroom teacher does not have the time to read
Mhm.
that complex
Yeah.
article, paper, meta-analyses. So Research had started as a voluntary run organization. It's still voluntary. Everybody volunteers their time from bottom all the way up. Every speaker volunteers their time. And they're
Wow.
like the leading names in the field in cognitive science or education and learning and research. And it started that. And what it did was it brought that valuable evidence into the classroom. And so
Hmm.
things started to shift. So it was only a matter of time when people be like, well, we are doing something similar too, which means we need to be talking more evidence into the classroom. And that's
Hmm.
sort of why it's voluntary sort of initiative.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
the tickets are really cheap. Conferences are expensive. People who are listening to this, they know conferences are expensive. So if you make a conference really expensive because you're paying people and all that kind of stuff, then it becomes inaccessible. But we
Yeah.
keep it accessible. It's really cheap too for teachers to come and they learn from the best of the best in the field. And the discussion again goes back to, well, let's just look at the evidence and make decision based on that, not because of something's popular or trendy or buzzwordy, but let's just look at the
Instagrammy, right? All the life advice that I've taken from Instagram is just ridiculous. I'm like, oh, that must be true. Oh, spider plants absorb 95% of the chemicals in your house. I was like, I'm going to buy one tomorrow. Oh, broccoli is actually not very good for you. I like that research. I believe like every single thing I read. I'm like the opposite of
yeah.
intelligent. I'm just like a normal consumer, and it's so dangerous as teachers. Well, the biggest thing we have to debunk is like this whole religious idea too. And I was just thinking it's easier to prove that God doesn't exist because you said you don't have to prove anything than to prove he exists. So to that degree, you could
That's
keep a religious person busy for a long time with that
yeah.
science background.
Yeah.
Mm.
So that's that. And then I think within education, every field has high stakes moments too. But in education, what happens is that you're dealing with young minds, their future. Parents are investing money, parents are investing time, and they have a lot of hope. When I send my kids for 6 hours to school, I hope that they're learning. And you talked about the word crime. I don't know about crime, and maybe, but I really think it's not, it's unethical. It's our
Mm.
moral responsibility to be in the position that we are in, having the
Ooh,
knowledge to present the sides so people can make informed decisions.
I got one. Help
Yeah.
me with this. My parents are German, and are your parents Indian?
Yes.
Okay, so our parents are both immigrants to Ontario. You're Quebec? Or no, you're Toronto.
No, I'm in Toronto, so I'm on Ontario, yes.
Okay, so when we were young, and I was very young, I wasn't born yet, but okay, so my mom had this hugest problem with the Canadian like health food chart thing, right? In India, there's like variety of stuff. People eat lentils, right? Find a Canadian kid who eats lentils, right? And turmeric. It's just like hot dogs, peanut butter, and I put some ketchup on that because that has tomatoes in it, right? So the food industry, like, you know, there's some giants, the food industry. I know this isn't school, but this is school, because if your kids are sick because of the crap that they're eating, and Canadian school tells you that pizza is the healthiest food ever because it has all 4 food groups, and Asians know that milk is not the go all because they did pretty well with that. Like, I know this isn't totally on topic, but isn't it hard to fight the popular thing if you don't have a lot of power? Or like, is it up to each one of us as parents to say, hey, actually, I'm not sure about that, to the principal? Do we have is it up to us now because our governments are corrupt?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. And I know there's a lot of, again, I was having this conversation with another mom. We were visiting, it was March break last week in Ontario. And this friend of mine, the other mom, said to me, she's like, I find it so difficult to shop in a grocery store now. I'm not talking about expensive. That's a problem that the whole world is facing. But she said, you just never know if what you're buying is like, what's in it, right? Even from the healthier stuff. And we're talking about apples. And, I told her, I'm like, you take an apple and take a knife and scrape on it, the wax starts to come off, right? And then I put that wax in a spoon and I say, eat it now. Would you eat it? You won't eat it, but you will eat it without knowing it. So the point is, you were talking about the healthy stuff and the food guide and all that kind of stuff, or unhealthy stuff. It is on us, unfortunately. The people in the position of power not necessarily making the right decisions, and that's why advocacy groups are important. That's why. So I'm looping it back to exactly what you said. That's why the kind of work you're doing is important. The kind of work parents doing is important. Here's another power of advocacy groups. So reading instruction was hurting. So I always keep going back to learning and all that kind of stuff. Reading instruction was hurting in Ontario. Kids weren't reading at grade level. And that is a huge problem, not just for Canada, but the entire world. If a kid cannot read in grade 3, 4, 5, that's the problem. Because look, we learn to read so that we can read to learn, right? The only way to gain knowledge is not through TikTok videos and stuff. That's entertainment. Okay, fine, that's good. Also, you don't know if it's good advice, but you gotta read. Reading is the power. Knowledge really is power. I really believe knowledge is such a beautiful thing. It's empowering. That's where I feel my power comes in. And I don't know, so I continue to learn and read and gain knowledge from like-minded people as well. But reading is important. But the kids can't read. That's a problem. Parent advocacy groups got really upset and got together, and I'm talking about something that happened over years, but finally that led to the change in how we are now doing reading instruction again. And we're saying, you know what, let's look at the evidence and see what actually works when we teach people how to read and what doesn't work. So let's not do that. That's exactly what I want, right? So same thing with food. But what my thing is that I think there's the bigger powers may or may not be looking at, because they have very different objectives. They have their own, personal goals and targets and milestones to achieve, and highly likely they're monetary. Sometimes they're power related. Right or wrong, I'm not in the position to judge here, but I do think that our own ability to gain knowledge and that is an added burden. I agree, that's an added burden. But I think we just have to continue doing that, because the stakes are a little too high to ignore those things, right? So we need to continue to learn, question, and make those right decisions, informed decisions that work for our immediate needs. Speaking of pizza, today's pizza day in my kids' school.
I've been to a lot of countries with openly corrupt governments. Like there's no, and we're from Canada, so we have a reputation of, Trudeau with all that drama. But it's not what other countries are, if I can just say it simply like that. And I think as Canadians, I grew up so innocent. It's like I didn't lock our door when we were kids. I trusted strangers all the time. I believe everything anyone tells me. It's like, and my boyfriend who's Nigerian, he's just like, he questions everything, you know, a Spanish person questions it as well. Someone from India, like your parents, 1 billion people, limited resources, high competition. You can't just believe what people are telling you. So I think we lack as North Americans in the easy life, maybe the upper middle class, the ones that had it so cushy and privileged. We have no critical thinking skills, I think. And I'm not sure if we can even compete with China, with India, like kick-ass women in STEM nowadays from India. Man, their minds are fast compared to like a Canadian 18-year-old who's like, I gotta lock my bike up. Oh, wow, those like, do you think that North Americans were in big trouble because of the system, or was it a better system?
Wow, I never thought about it like that. But when you say it, I'm thinking, so I actually grew up in India. So I've been living in Canada since 2007. So when you were saying all that, not being able to trust, questioning everything, and growing up a woman in Delhi. So you gotta question every move you make, what you're wearing, what time you're going out, leaving the bag, and it's true. So I will say I would always have my bag close to me and this and that. And I've been living in Canada far too long now. There are days when I forget to zip it. It's like it does make you a little I don't know, softer, I would say. So that could translate perhaps into the critical thinking situation, because I think and it's not again, I always say that it's not coming from an ill-intentional space. It's nice that people have been more trusting of each other. But now the world's a very it's a messy place. So I think we always have to take everything with a grain of salt and be like, okay, let's just analyze this, because it's easy to believe and it's just easy to go with that trust feeling. But and it would be a nice, ideal, harmonious world, but sadly it doesn't work like that, So like when I'm raising my kids, I do tell them often, I'm like, well, it was not like that when I was a kid. And, locking the locker. But first time ever, something got stolen from my daughter's, locker because it wasn't locked. And she says, I'm never leaving it unlocked again. So sometimes you also have to learn from that perspective. But when you say like that, maybe there is an impact on how critical thinking also gets impacted in terms of how you've been raised or what your environment's been like, right? So that makes sense. Like I have always picked everything it's like I'm picking an apple. I'm like, oh, is there a worm in it? Like there's always that question before I bite into it. Do you know what I'm saying? So that idea of scraping the apple with a knife also came from that.
You actually did that.
And sure enough, there was wax on it, Jessica, a lot of wax. And even the organic ones have it, by the way. So that is interesting. Yeah. I don't know the answer, but I think that part of it could be a part of a, kind of like a plausible decision. Yeah.
Well, laziness is I guess it's that way. If you want to go out there and fight in the rain, I was making the joke, it was Women's International Day, and here it was about to rain. And I'm sure in the blizzard that you guys had 2 weeks ago, like Canada was crap, I heard this winter. There's nobody, I don't know, were there women marching on March 8th in Toronto for extended hours?
I don't know. Actually, I have to say it might have happened because a lot of the snow did melt by that time. We did have a lot of snow. I didn't go, personally, but I did my part from where I am, making impact and doing the work and supporting the women across the world. I'm not sure. I can't be sure if that actually happened, but I'm sure.
Easier to believe what they say.
There was not so much snow by that time. March 8th was just, we actually had nice weather actually that day.
And the whole thing is like, it's easier. So if we say there's 3 or 4, I just remember from Tony Robbins, VAK, VAK. I didn't even know the R part. So I haven't even updated my skills, and I teach every day. So I just learned what I learned when I was 20. And I guess I haven't really kept up with it because, well, it kind of works and you do get enough results, but that's the opposite of what we should be doing. But it's overwhelming. There's so much stuff to learn, to do, and then you don't know AI, lots of excuses. But yes, our educators and advocates. So thank you for running your research as advocates, as volunteers. Thank you for making it affordable to people so that it's not just for the elite who can control everything. It's for the people and the people's people. So.
And teachers and our kids, and to raise a better sort of young thinking mind, and they can take the knowledge and do something good with it rather than just, yeah. I try. I do my little part, and I have a lot of support. I know I don't do anything alone, which is what makes it possible. But yeah, it's a wonderful thing.
Yeah. Wow. I enjoyed that. Nice to talk to a Canadian who's doing really cool things. Because when I'm in Canada in the winter, I just like do nothing and I get like a seasonal depression. So it's cool to see that you guys are still fighting.
It's a lovely sunny day. You know, and now tiny little buds. I have a 3-year-old who I was taking her to the daycare the other day, and she heard the birds, and she said to me, "Mama, I hear the bird. That means spring is coming." And I was like, "Oh, that's so true." And then I said, "Okay, when we go to school," because I noticed there was a tree, and the tree has these tiny little red buds. So I said, "Let me show you the buds, and that's another sign of spring." So now it could also snow in April. So let's not get ahead of ourselves, but I always tell people ask me, how do you do all the things? And I say one thing at a time. Also, another very popular myth I'm going to debunk before we go. Multitasking is a myth. Multitasking that requires 2 thinking tasks does not work. It is a very glorified idea. People say, I'm multitasking. Well, you can multitask things like chewing gum and running and listening to music, but you can't have 2 conversations. You can read and talk to someone because that requires thinking. The brain is not designed to do that. Now, it's a very glorified idea. It is on job descriptions, specifications, and all that kind of stuff. I challenge people and I say, look it up, look at the evidence. It just doesn't work. Now, motor multitasking can work, like riding a unicycle and doing juggling, but that's nothing. It's an automatized thing. Driving and listening to a podcast, one action is automatized, the other one is not. So you're listening and paying attention. But you can't listen to a podcast and have a conversation at the same time with your passenger, right? So multitasking doesn't work. So it's all of that. So just so how do I do things? One thing at a time and one day at a time. So today is a sunny day and we'll take it.
Very Buddhist. One thing at a time, one day at a time, one kid at a time, one conference at a time, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And one email at a time, people. One email at a time.
Okay. It's been delightful.
Oh, it's been delightful. Thank you, Jessica. Thanks for all the
I'll see you on LinkedIn.
Yes, absolutely.
Bye. Take care. Thank you.